Richard Davenport stepped out of his shiny black Mercedes, his expensive Italian shoes crunching on the gravel of Samuel Reed's driveway. The old farmhouse looked like it was about to fall apart. Paint peeled from the wooden walls, and the front porch sagged in the middle. Richard wrinkled his nose at the smell of manure from the nearby barn. "I can't believe Mary convinced me to come here," he muttered, adjusting his silk tie. His assistant had insisted he make an appearance at this charity event. Something about showing the company cared about local farmers. Richard thought it was a waste of time. Samuel Reed came out to greet him, wiping his calloused hands on his worn jeans. His plaid shirt had patches on the elbows, and his work boots were caked with mud. He smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Davenport. It's not much, but it's honest work we do here." Richard barely touched Samuel's hand, quickly pulling out his handkerchief to wipe his own afterward. "Yes, well, let's get this over with. I have a dinner meeting at the country club in 2 hours." Inside the house was clean but shabby. The furniture looked like it came from a thrift store, and the linoleum floor was cracked in places. Samuel's wife Betty, a plump woman with grey hair tied back in a bun, stirred a pot on the ancient stove. "Dinner's almost ready," she said cheerfully. "I hope you like vegetable soup. The vegetables are fresh from our garden." Richard sat stiffly at the scratched kitchen table. "I usually dine at 5-star restaurants." Betty served the soup in mismatched bowls, adding some homemade bread on the side. Richard stared at the simple meal, his lip curling in disgust. "This is what you call dinner? A bowl of water with a few vegetables floating in it?" He pushed the bowl away. "No wonder you people live like this. You have nothing and you'll always be nothing." Betty's face fell, and Samuel's gentle expression hardened slightly. But instead of getting angry, he simply bowed his head and said grace, thanking God for their food and their guest. "Mr. Davenport," Samuel said quietly, "wealth isn't just about money. We may not have fancy things, but we have peace in our hearts. And love in our home." Richard laughed coldly. "Peace and love don't pay bills or buy success. Look at this place and it's falling apart. Your equipment is ancient. You're barely surviving." "We get by," Samuel replied, "and we help our neighbors when they need it. That's worth something." "Worth nothing in the real world," Richard scoffed, standing up. "I've seen enough. Mary can mark this charity visit as complete, though I don't know why we waste time on lost causes like this farm." As Richard headed for the door, he heard Betty whisper to Samuel, "He'll learn someday, dear. God has a way of teaching people what really matters." Richard drove away from the farm, his expensive car kicking up dust on the dirt road. In his rearview mirror, he saw Samuel and Betty standing on their porch, still waving goodbye despite his rudeness. The next morning, Richard sat in his luxurious office on the top floor of the Davenport building, signing papers for his latest acquisition. He'd just bought out another small farming operation, planning to turn it into an industrial complex. His secretary buzzed in on the intercom. "Sir, you might want to turn on the news." Richard clicked on the massive TV mounted on his office wall. The local news was showing a live report from a familiar location, Samuel Reed's farm. "Breaking news," the reporter announced excitedly. "Local farmer Samuel Reed has made an extraordinary discovery in his henhouse this morning. What appears to be a solid gold egg, roughly the size of an ostrich egg, was found among his regular chicken eggs." The camera showed Samuel holding an enormous, gleaming egg. Experts were already on the scene, confirming it was pure gold. Richard's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on his imported marble floor. "Early estimates suggest the egg could be worth upwards of $50 million, the reporter continued. "Mr. Reed, what are your plans for this incredible discovery?" Samuel's weathered face appeared on screen, still wearing the same patched shirt from yesterday. "Well, first thing we're going to do is help our neighbors. The Wilsons need a new tractor and the Johnson kids need college money. After that, we'll see what else our community needs." Richard stared at the TV in disbelief. The man he'd called worthless yesterday was now worth more than him. The simple farmer he'd mocked was talking about giving away millions like it was nothing. He grabbed his keys and raced to his car. The drive to the farm seemed shorter this time, his mind racing with possibilities. Maybe he could convince Samuel to invest in his company. Maybe they could strike a deal. When he arrived, the farm was crowded with news vans and curious onlookers. Richard pushed his way through, fixing his most charming smile on his face. "Samuel, my good friend Samuel," he called out. Samuel turned from the reporters, that same gentle smile on his face. "Mr. Davenport, back so soon?" Richard's practiced charm faltered in the face of Samuel's calm demeanor. "Yes, I thought perhaps we could discuss some investment opportunities. With your newfound wealth—" "Actually," Samuel interrupted softly, "Betty just made a fresh pot of vegetable soup. Would you care to join us for lunch? The same meal you refused yesterday." Richard's face flushed red as several reporters turned their cameras toward him. Samuel wasn't being spiteful. His invitation seemed genuinely kind. That somehow made it worse. Yes, thank you," Richard managed to say. Inside the kitchen, away from the cameras, Betty served the same simple soup in the same mismatched bowls. This time Richard ate every bite. "You know," Samuel said as they finished their meal, "this gold egg is a blessing, but it's not what makes us rich. Yesterday, we had everything that mattered. Enough food to share, a home filled with love and the joy of helping others. Today, we just have more resources to share those blessings." Richard stared into his empty soup bowl, seeing his own reflection in the broth. For the first time in years, he felt truly poor. The news about Samuel's golden egg spread like wildfire through the small town of Pine Grove. Every morning, more reporters camped outside the farm's gate, hoping to get an interview. But Samuel kept going about his daily routine, feeding the chickens, milking the cows, and tending to his crops. "I don't understand," one reporter said to Betty. "Your husband is now one of the richest men in the state. Why is he still doing farm work?" Betty smiled as she watched Samuel carrying feed to the chicken coop. "Because that's who he is. Money doesn't change a person's heart." Meanwhile, Richard Davenport couldn't sleep at night. He tossed and turned in his king-sized bed, remembering how he'd treated Samuel just days before. His own words haunted him. "You have nothing, and you'll always be nothing." One morning, Richard's assistant Mary brought him troubling news. "Sir, our stock prices are dropping. People are pulling their investments from Davenport Industries." "What? Why?" Richard demanded, spilling coffee on his expensive desk calendar. Mary shifted uncomfortably. "Well, someone leaked a video of your visit to the Reed farm. Your comments about them being worthless, it's gone viral. People are calling for a boycott of our products." Richard slumped in his leather chair. Everything he'd built was starting to crumble, all because of one farmer and his golden egg. He needed to fix this, and fast. He drove to the Reed farm again. But this time he parked his Mercedes behind the house, away from the reporters. Samuel was in the barn fixing an old tractor. "Mr. Reed," Richard called out softly. "Could we talk?" Samuel wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Of course." "Betty, just made some fresh lemonade. Join me on the porch?" They sat in creaky rocking chairs, sipping lemonade from mason jars. Richard noticed how peaceful it felt, away from the noise of the city and the pressure of his office. "I came to apologize," Richard said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I was wrong about you, about everything." Samuel rocked quietly for a moment. "You know, Mr. Davenport, when I found that egg, my first thought wasn't about what I could buy, it was about who I could help." "I don't understand that," Richard admitted. "All my life, I've only thought about getting more for myself." "And has it made you happy?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He looked at his expensive watch, his designer suit, thought about his empty mansion and his loveless marriage to a socialite who was always away at some spa. "No," he whispered. "No, it hasn't." Just then, Betty came out with a pie she'd just baked. The smell of apples and cinnamon filled the air. "Would you like a slice, Mr. Davenport?" Richard started to refuse automatically. His personal trainer had him on a strict diet. But then he looked at the warm pie and Betty's kind face. "Yes, please. And please call me Richard." As they ate, Samuel told him about their plans for the money. They were setting up a fund to help local farmers modernize their equipment. They were creating scholarships for rural kids who wanted to go to college. They were building a new community center where people could gather for meals and celebrations. "Why don't you just buy a mansion in the city?" Richard asked. "You could live like a king." Samuel laughed. "I already live like a king. I have work. That matters. A wife I love and neighbors who care about each other. The gold just means we can help more people." Later that afternoon, Richard watched as a young couple came to visit the Reeds. The woman was crying with gratitude. Samuel had just paid off their farm's mortgage so they wouldn't lose their land to the bank. Richard recognized them. His company had been planning to foreclose on their property next month. He'd seen them as just another business transaction, not as real people with hopes and dreams. That evening, as Richard drove home, he didn't take his usual route through the city. Instead, he drove through the countryside, really looking at the small farms and humble homes he usually ignored. He thought about all the small farmers he'd pushed out of business over the years, all the families he'd displaced to build his shopping centers and parking lots. He'd told himself it was just business, just progress, but now he saw it differently. When he got home, he went straight to his home office. He stayed up all night, going through his company's files. In the morning, he called an emergency board meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to his shocked board members, "we're going to make some changes, big changes." The first thing he did was cancel all pending foreclosures on family farms. Then he started a program to help small farmers refinance their loans at lower rates. His shareholders were furious. The stock price dropped even further. But for the first time in his life, Richard didn't care about the money. He went back to Samuel's farm the next day, this time with a proposal. Not a business deal, but something different. "I want to learn," he told Samuel. "Teach me about farming, about community, about what really matters." Samuel smiled and handed him a pair of work boots. "First lesson starts at sunrise tomorrow. Hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty." That night, Richard Davenport, the man who once owned 3 Rolls-Royces, went shopping for his first pair of overalls. And somehow spending $20 at the local farm supply store felt more satisfying than any $1 million deal he'd ever made. Richard's wife Victoria couldn't believe her eyes when she returned from her month-long spa retreat in Switzerland. Her husband was wearing muddy boots and old jeans, sitting at their fancy kitchen counter eating a homemade sandwich. "Have you lost your mind?" she shrieked, dropping her designer handbag. "The newspapers are saying you've gone crazy. You're giving away our money to farmers." Richard looked at his wife calmly. "I'm doing what's right, Victoria, for the first time in my life." "Right?" She laughed bitterly. "What's right about destroying everything we've built? My friends won't even talk to me anymore. They think you've joined some kind of farming cult." Before Richard could answer, his phone rang. It was Samuel Reed. "Richard, you need to come to the farm right away," Samuel said, his voice serious. "Something's happened." When Richard arrived at the Reed farm, he found police cars everywhere. The golden egg had been stolen. Betty was crying in the kitchen while Samuel talked to the police. "It happened during the night," Samuel explained. "Someone broke into the safe in the barn where we kept it." Richard noticed something odd right away. "The safe in the barn? Why would you keep something so valuable out there?" "We were going to move it to the bank tomorrow," Betty said, wiping her eyes. "We just needed it one more day because the photographer from the local paper was coming to take pictures for the story about our community fund." The police officer shook his head. "Seems like someone knew exactly when to strike. This was no random theft." Richard felt sick to his stomach as a thought struck him. Victoria had asked a lot of questions about the egg last night, about where it was kept, about the Reed security system. He pulled out his phone and checked their bank account. His heart sank. Victoria had withdrawn $5 million early this morning. "I think I know who did this," Richard said quietly. He told the police about Victoria's questions and the money withdrawal. They immediately put out an alert for her. Samuel put a hand on Richard's shoulder. "I'm sorry. This must be hard for you." Richard shook his head. "Don't apologize. I'm the one who's sorry. The old me would have done exactly what Victoria did. I probably would have planned it better." Just then, Mary, Richard's assistant, rushed into the kitchen. "Mr. Davenport, you need to see this." She held up her tablet. On the screen was a video of Victoria, clearly filmed earlier that morning. She was standing in front of a private plane, the golden egg visible in a case beside her. "Hello, darling," she said to the camera with a cold smile. "By the time you see this, I'll be in a country with no extradition treaty. Consider this my divorce settlement," she laughed. "Oh, and I've also transferred everything from our joint accounts. You want to live like a farmer? Now you can. The police traced the plane to a small, private airfield, but they were too late. Victoria was gone, along with the egg and millions of dollars. Richard sat heavily in one of the Reeds' kitchen chairs. I've lost everything. The money, my wife, probably my company once this gets out. But Samuel and Betty didn't seem upset about the egg. Instead, they were worried about him. Money comes and goes, Samuel said. But you haven't lost everything. You found something much more valuable. You found your conscience. Betty brought him a cup of hot coffee and a slice of fresh bread. You're family now, she said, simply. And family sticks together. Richard looked around the humble kitchen at these people who had every right to hate him for bringing this trouble into their lives. Instead, they were comforting him. But what about all your plans, he asked. The community center, the scholarships helping the other farmers. Samuel smiled. God provides. Maybe not always in the way we expect, but He provides. Just then, they heard excited shouting from the chicken coop. One of the farmhands came running in, his eyes wide. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed, you need to come see this. They all hurried to the chicken coop. There in one of the nests was another golden egg. The police officer stared in amazement. I'll be damned. Samuel picked up the egg carefully. Well, would you look at that? Betty started laughing through her tears. See? God provides. Richard looked at the new egg, then at the Reeds, then back at the egg. I don't understand. How is this possible? Samuel shrugged. Some mysteries aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to be appreciated. The news about the second egg spread quickly. Victoria's theft was still a scandal, but it was overshadowed by what people started calling the miracle of Reed Farm. That evening, as they all sat on the porch watching the sunset, Richard realized something. He'd spent his whole life chasing wealth, thinking it would make him happy. Now he had lost all his money, his wife had betrayed him, and his reputation was in shambles. Yet sitting here drinking Betty's lemonade and listening to Samuel talk about crop rotation, he felt richer than he'd ever been. News of the second golden egg brought even more attention to Reed Farm. Scientists from big universities wanted to study the chickens. Rich collectors offered millions just to buy one hen. TV crews camped out, day and night, hoping to catch the moment another egg might appear. But the peace of the farm was about to be disturbed by more than just reporters. One morning, a sleek black car pulled up to the farmhouse. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. Alexander Davenport, Richard's younger brother. Well, well, Alexander said, looking at Richard in his work clothes. The mighty Richard Davenport, shoveling manure. Mother would be so proud. Richard straightened up, leaning on his shovel. What do you want, Alex? The board of directors sent me. Alexander smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They're concerned about the company's future. Your little farming adventure has cost our shareholders millions. Samuel and Betty watched from the porch as the brothers talked. They could see Richard's face getting redder and redder. You can't do this, Richard shouted finally. Already done, big brother, Alexander said smoothly. As of this morning, I'm the new CEO of Davenport Industries. You've been voted out. Richard staggered like he'd been hit. The company had been his whole life for 30 years. His father had started it, built it from nothing. Don't worry, Alexander added. I'll take good care of Dad's legacy, starting with buying this whole valley and turning it into the biggest industrial park in the state. Samuel stepped forward. This valley isn't for sale. Alexander laughed. Everything's for sale, Mr. Reed. It's just a matter of price. And now that my dear brother has lost control of the company, he can't protect you anymore. After Alexander left, Richard sat heavily on the porch steps. I'm sorry, he said to Samuel and Betty. This is all my fault. If I hadn't changed, if I'd stayed the ruthless businessman I was, then you'd be just like your brother, Betty said firmly. Empty inside and mean as a snake. Samuel nodded. She's right. The man you were before would never have found peace here. Just then, they heard excited voices from the chicken coop again. But this time when they rushed over, they found something different. Instead of a golden egg, there was a silver one, shining like moonlight. I've never seen anything like it, the local veterinarian said when she came to examine it. First gold, now silver. These eggs defy scientific explanation. Word about the silver eggs spread fast. That afternoon, a famous jeweler from New York arrived to examine both eggs. The golden eggs are pure gold, he confirmed, and this silver one, it's platinum actually, even more valuable than gold. Alexander heard the news too. That evening, he came back to the farm. My offer still stands, he said, but now it's double. Name your price, Mr. Reed. Everyone has one. Samuel looked at his wife, then at Richard, then back at Alexander. You're right. Everyone does have a price. Alexander smiled triumphantly. But mine isn't money, Samuel continued. My price is knowing. I did right by my neighbors. Knowing I helped people instead of hurting them. Can you pay that price, Mr. Davenport? Alexander's smile disappeared. You're making a big mistake. I'll bury you in lawsuits. I'll dam up your water supply. I'll make life so hard you'll beg to sell. Richard stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Samuel. No, you won't, Alex, because if you try, I'll tell everyone what really happened to Dad's original will, the one that disappeared the day before he died. Alexander's face went white. You can't prove anything. Maybe not, Richard agreed. But people will talk, questions will be asked. Are you ready for that kind of attention? After Alexander stormed off, Samuel turned to Richard. What was that about your father's will? Richard sighed. Something I should have dealt with years ago. Alex altered Dad's will to get more control of the company. I knew but never said anything because I was just as greedy as he was back then. That night, as they sat around the Reeds' kitchen table eating Betty's chicken pot pie, they tried to figure out what to do next. Alexander won't give up easily, Richard warned. He'll find other ways to pressure us. Then we'll face them together, Samuel said. The whole community will. As if to prove his point, pickup trucks started arriving at the farm. Word had spread about Alexander's threats. Farmers from all around the valley came to show their support. Old Jim Watson brought his famous apple pies. The Martinez family came with tamales. The Andersons brought fresh bread. Soon the kitchen was full of food and friends. See, Betty said to Richard, this is real wealth. You can't buy this. Richard looked around at all the faces, weather-worn, honest faces of people who worked the land. People he would once have dismissed as beneath him. Now he saw their true value. I think I finally understand what you've been trying to teach me, Samuel, he said. It's not about what you have. It's about who you have beside you. Samuel smiled. Now you're getting it. And speaking of what we have, he pulled out a small box. Inside was a tiny egg, smaller than a chicken egg, made of what looked like crystal. Found it this morning, he said. Haven't told anyone else yet. Seems like these eggs appear when we need them most. Richard stared at the crystal egg. What? Do you think it means? I think, Samuel said slowly, it means we're about to face our biggest challenge yet, but also that we won't face it alone. The crystal egg turned out to be just the beginning. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a shocking headline. Davenport Industries accused of illegal dumping. Someone had leaked documents showing the company had been poisoning the valley's groundwater for years. Richard stared at the paper, his hands shaking. I didn't know about this, Samuel. I swear I didn't. We believe you, Betty said, pouring him another cup of coffee. But your brother probably did. The story got bigger when more farmers came forward. Many had lost livestock. Mysteriously over the years, others had crops fail for no apparent reason. All of them had land near Davenport Industries factories. Alexander appeared on TV, claiming it was all lies. But his smooth talking couldn't hide the truth anymore. The State Environmental Agency launched an investigation. That's when strange things started happening at Reed Farm. First, their tractor broke down. The mechanic found sugar in the gas tank. Then their irrigation system was sabotaged, threatening their crops during a dry spell. But each time something went wrong, help arrived. Neighbors brought their own tractors. The high school football team helped run emergency water lines. The whole community pulled together. The crystal egg sat on the Reed's mantelpiece, sparkling mysteriously. Some days it seemed to glow from within, especially when good things happened. One evening, as everyone gathered for another community dinner at the farm, Mary, Richard's former assistant, arrived with big news. "I've been doing some digging," she said, pulling out a thick folder, "and I found something interesting about those factory sites Alexander wants to build." She spread out some maps on the kitchen table. "See these markers? They show underground springs, pure water sources, some of the cleanest in the state." Samuel studied the maps. "So that's why he wants this land so badly." Richard nodded slowly. "He's not planning an industrial park. He wants to control the water supply. In a few years, clean water will be worth more than gold. Just like his daddy," old Jim Watson spat. "Old man Davenport tried the same thing 30 years ago. Tried to buy up all the water rights. Would have turned us all into slaves to his water company." Richard looked surprised. "I never knew that about Dad." "Course not," Jim said. "Your daddy changed his mind at the last minute. Said he'd had a dream that showed him the evil of his ways. That's when he wrote his second will, the one that disappeared." Richard sat up straight. "Wait a minute. What exactly did that second will say?" "Said the company had to set aside half its profits to protect local water sources," Jim remembered. "Had some kind of trust fund set up for it and everything. Your brother threw a fit when he heard about it." Mary's eyes lit up. "A trust fund? Those leave paper trails. Give me a few days. I might be able to find something." The next few days were tense. Alexander's pressure got worse. Building inspectors showed up at farms all over the valley, finding imaginary violations. Health department officials appeared, making threats about regulations, but the crystal egg glowed brighter than ever. Then one morning, Betty went to check on the chickens and found something incredible. Next to the crystal egg was a new egg, one that looked like it was made of pure light. "It's warm," she said when the others gathered around. "And listen, it's humming." The humming got louder as Mary's car raced up the driveway. She burst into the house waving a stack of papers. "I found it," she shouted. "The original trust documents. Alexander couldn't destroy them all because they were filed in 3 different states. The papers proved everything. The altered will, the secret trust fund, Alexander's illegal dealings. It was all there." Richard took the documents downtown to the district attorney's office. By that evening, Alexander was being led out. Of his office in handcuffs, his face all over the news. But something even bigger was happening back at Reed Farm. The glowing egg had started to pulse with light, like a heartbeat. "What do you think it means?" Richard asked Samuel. Before Samuel could answer, they heard shouts from outside. The whole valley had gone dark, except for Reed Farm, which was lit up like daylight. People started gathering, drawn by the strange light. They watched in amazement as the egg's glow spread, flowing like water through the ground. The next morning, every contaminated well in the valley was clean again. The poisoned soil was restored. Even the sick animals recovered. The headlines called it the miracle of the valley. Scientists couldn't explain it, but the farmers understood. "It's simple," Samuel said to the reporters who flocked to the farm. "When people come together with love in their hearts, real miracles can happen." Richard stood next to his friend. No longer the ruthless businessman, but a changed man. "The real miracle," he said, "is learning what truly matters. And it's not money or power. It's community. It's caring for each other and the land." Betty wrapped her arms around both men. "And family," she added. "The kind you're born with and the kind you find along the way." The crystal egg and the glowing egg stayed on the Reed's mantelpiece, next to pictures of their growing farm family. Sometimes visitors swore they could still hear them humming, a soft, peaceful sound like the earth itself singing. The arrest of Alexander Davenport made national news. Reporters camped outside Reed Farm, hoping to get interviews about the miracle eggs and the restored valley. But an even bigger surprise was waiting for everyone. Victoria, Richard's ex-wife, returned to town. She walked into the farm's kitchen one morning, looking nothing like the glamorous socialite who had stolen the first golden egg. Her designer clothes were wrinkled and her perfect makeup was gone. "I came to return this," she said quietly, placing the original golden egg on the kitchen table, "and to turn myself in." Everyone stared at her in shock. Betty was the first to speak. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, already pulling out a cup. That was Betty's way, treating everyone with kindness, even those who had wronged her. Victoria burst into tears. "I don't understand." Why are you being nice to me? I stole from you. I tried to ruin everything. Samuel pulled out a chair for her. Sit down and tell us what happened. Through her tears, Victoria told them her story. She had fled to a private island with the egg and the stolen money. But something strange started happening. Everything I bought with that money turned to dust, she said. Jewelry, clothes, even the food went bad instantly. It was like the egg was cursing everything. It touched. Richard listened quietly. The man he used to be would have enjoyed seeing Victoria brought low, but now he just felt sad for her. I couldn't sleep, Victoria continued. Every night I dreamed about this farm, about the kindness I felt here, even when I was plotting to steal from you. The egg started glowing brighter and brighter, like it was angry with me. She looked around the simple kitchen. I finally understood what Richard had found here. Something real, something money can't buy. Samuel picked up the golden egg. The moment he touched it, it started glowing warmly again. The egg knows when it's home, he said simply. Just then, Mary burst in with more news. You won't believe what they found in Alexander's private office. She spread out more documents on the table. Bank statements, secret accounts, and most importantly, security camera footage from the night their father died. Alexander didn't just change the will, Mary explained. He was there that night. The footage shows him entering your father's room just before Richard put his head in his hands. Are you saying my brother murdered our father? The police came to take Victoria's statement about the egg theft. She went willingly, ready to face the consequences of her actions. But before she left, she had one more confession. Richard, she said softly, there's something else you need to know. Something about your brother and your father's death. I knew about it. That's how Alexander convinced me to help him try to take over the farm. He blackmailed me because I kept his secret. The truth hit the community hard. Alexander hadn't just poisoned the valley's water. He'd poisoned his own family with greed and murder. That night, nobody felt like eating dinner. Even Betty's famous apple pie sat untouched. But as they sat in sad silence, something amazing happened. All three eggs, the golden one, the crystal one, and the glowing one, started humming in harmony. Their light filled the kitchen, warm and comforting like a mother's hug. Sarah Johnson, the oldest resident of the valley, had come over to bring some fresh vegetables. When she saw the glowing eggs, she gasped. My grandmother told me stories, she said, her voice shaking with excitement, about magical eggs that appeared in times of great trouble. They say they come to heal not just the land, but people's hearts. Samuel nodded slowly. That makes sense. Every time an egg appeared, it was when someone needed healing. The golden egg came when Richard needed to learn about true wealth. The crystal egg appeared when the valley needed healing. And the glowing egg came when we all needed to see the truth, Betty finished. About Alexander, about Victoria, about everything. Richard looked at the eggs, thinking about his brother in jail and his ex-wife facing justice. But what about them? Can their hearts be healed too? As if in answer, the eggs' humming grew louder. The light spread out through the windows, reaching toward the town jail where Victoria and Alexander were held. In his cell, Alexander saw the light and fell to his knees, weeping for the first time since he was a child. In her cell, Victoria felt a warmth she'd never known before, like her heart was defrosting after being frozen for years. Back at the farm, Samuel put his arm around Richard's shoulders. Everyone deserves a chance to change. You taught us that. Richard looked at his friend in surprise. Me? You were just as lost as they were, Betty reminded him. But you found your way back to what matters. Maybe they can too. The eggs hummed. In agreement, their light touching everyone in the valley like a blessing. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Fireflies danced in the garden, their lights twinkling in harmony with the eggs' glow. Tomorrow, Samuel said, we'll start healing the hearts that need it most. Nobody knew exactly what that would mean. But with the magical eggs glowing on the mantelpiece and love filling the farmhouse kitchen, anything seemed possible. The next morning, Samuel and Betty woke up to find their front yard full of people. Word had spread about the eggs' healing light, and folks had come from all over, hoping for miracles of their own. We don't even know if it works that way, Samuel told the crowd gently. The eggs seem to have their own wisdom about these things, but something strange was already happening. As people gathered on the farm, sharing their stories and struggles, the egg's glow grew stronger. A young woman named Lisa stepped forward. She hadn't spoken to her mother in 10 years over a family fight. Neither of them could even remember clearly. "Last night," Lisa said, "I saw that light from my window, and suddenly all the anger just melted away. I called Mom for the first time in a decade." Her mother emerged from the crowd, and they hugged, both crying. The golden egg pulsed with warm light. Richard watched all this from the porch, thinking about his own broken family. Victoria was still in jail, awaiting her trial. Alexander faced much more serious charges for their father's death. "Maybe I should visit them," he said. "To Betty." Betty squeezed his hand. The egg seemed to think so. When Richard went to the jail, he found Victoria first. She looked different, humbled but somehow more real than she'd ever been in her designer clothes and perfect makeup. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I didn't think I would either," Richard admitted. "But I learned something at Reed. Farm, holding on to anger only hurts yourself." Victoria wiped away tears. "I keep thinking about Betty, how she offered me coffee when I came to confess. She had every right to hate me, but instead she showed me kindness. That's who they are," Richard said, "and somehow being around them makes you want to be better too." Next, Richard visited Alexander. His brother sat on the other side of the glass, looking old and tired. "Come to gloat?" Alexander asked bitterly. Richard shook his head. "No, I came to ask why. Why did you kill Dad?" Alexander's face crumpled. "He was going to ruin everything. All our plans for expansion, for making the company bigger. He said he'd had some sort of spiritual awakening, started talking about protecting the land, about our responsibility to the community. Sounds like he learned what I learned at Reed Farm," Richard said quietly. "I was so angry," Alexander whispered. "I went to argue with him that night. He wouldn't listen. I just pushed him. I didn't mean for him to hit his head. But then he was lying there and I... For the first time, Richard saw his brother clearly, not as the smooth, confident businessman, but as a scared, broken man who'd let greed poison his soul. Back at the farm, more people were arriving. The egg's light had spread further, touching. More hearts, healing more wounds. Old enemies shook hands. Estranged families reunited. Even the land seemed to glow with new life. Betty had set up tables in the yard, and everyone brought food to share. The smell of home cooking filled the air. Fried chicken, fresh bread, apple pies, and more dishes than anyone could count. "This is what community looks like," Samuel told the gathered crowd. "Not just sharing the good times, but helping each other through the hard times too." As the sun began to set, something magical happened. The 3 eggs started floating in the air, their light growing brighter and brighter. Everyone watched in awe as the eggs moved together, merging their light into a single brilliant beam that shot up into the sky. When the light faded, the eggs had transformed. In their place was a simple ceramic bowl painted with scenes of farm life and filled with clear, sparkling water. Sarah Johnson, the oldest resident, gasped. "The healing bowl. My grandmother's stories mentioned this too. They say it appears when the egg's work is done to remind us that the real magic isn't in golden eggs or mysterious lights. The real magic," Samuel finished, "is in sharing what we have with others." Richard thought about Victoria and Alexander in their cells, about his own journey from ruthless businessman to part of this farming community. "The bowl isn't just for drinking, is it?" he asked Samuel. Samuel smiled. "No, I think it's showing us our next step. Some people need more than just a moment of magical light to heal. They need a community to help them change. Like I did," Richard said softly. Betty nodded. "Exactly. And now maybe it's time to help others find their way too." The ceramic bowl glowed softly in the gathering dusk, its water reflecting the faces of everyone gathered around it. In its depths, they could see images. Victoria helping at a homeless shelter, Alexander working to restore the land he had poisoned, people coming together to rebuild not just buildings but lives. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, "we'll start planning the new community center, a place where anyone can come to heal, to learn, to start over." Richard looked at his friends, his new family really, and felt a deep peace. The eggs had done their work. Now it was up to the people to continue what they had started. The idea for the community center grew faster than anyone expected. People from all over the valley came forward to help, each bringing what they could offer. Jim Watson donated part of his land right in the center of town. "Been holding on to this property for 40 years, he said. "Always knew it was meant for something special." The Martinez family offered their construction skills. The Anderson brothers brought their architectural expertise. Even the high school students got involved, designing gardens and planning programs. Richard sat with Samuel and Betty at their kitchen table, looking over the plans. "We'll need more than just a building," Richard said. "We need to help people. Like Victoria and Alexander find their way back. That's why we're adding the rehabilitation farm," Betty explained, pointing to the drawings, "a place where people can learn to work the land, to grow things, to heal." The ceramic bowl sat in the center of the table, its water still showing glimpses of possible futures. Today, it showed images of people working together in gardens, learning new skills, finding hope again. Victoria's trial came up first. She stood before the judge, ready to accept her punishment for stealing the golden egg. But something unexpected happened. Samuel and Betty came to speak on her behalf. "She returned what she took," Samuel told the judge. "More importantly, she's truly sorry. We believe she deserves a chance to make things right." The judge looked at Victoria. "And how do you propose to do that, Mrs. Davenport?" Victoria stood straight. "I want to work at the new community center, not as a rich person doing charity, but as someone who needs to learn about real values. I'll start at the bottom and work my way up just like everyone else." The judge agreed to let Victoria serve her sentence through community service at the center once it was built. Alexander's case was harder. Murder charges couldn't be wished away, no matter how sorry he was. But even from jail, he wanted to help. "I know where all the toxic dumping sites are," he told Richard during a visit. "I'll help clean them up. And I have overseas accounts. Use that money to restore the land." Richard brought this information to the authorities. It would take years to clean up all the damage, but at least now they could start. The ceramic bowls. Water stirred when Richard told Samuel about Alexander's offer. Images appeared of restored streams, clean soil, healthy crops growing where wasteland had been. Construction on the community center began as summer turned to fall. Every day brought new volunteers, new ideas, new hope. Martha Chen, a retired teacher, offered to start literacy classes. "Some folks never had the chance to learn reading properly," she said. "It's never too late to start." Tom Williams, a recovering addict who'd found peace working at Reed Farm, wanted to start a support group. "Sometimes you just need someone who understands what you're going through," he explained. The local doctors offered to run a free clinic one day a week. The high school cooking teacher volunteered to teach nutrition classes. A group of farmers began planning workshops on sustainable agriculture. But the heart of it all was the rehabilitation farm. 10 acres where people could come to work, learn, and heal. "Working with growing things changes you," Samuel explained to a group of volunteers. "When you plant a seed and watch it grow, something grows inside you too. Hope, patience, understanding." Betty organized a program to teach canning and preserving. "People need practical skills," she said, "but they also need to feel useful, to know they're contributing something valuable." Richard found himself working alongside people from all walks of life, former executives who'd lost everything, young people who'd gotten in trouble with the law, folks struggling with addiction or depression, all of them finding new purpose in the soil. One day, as they took a break from building the center's main hall, Richard watched a group of teenagers helping an elderly woman plant tomatoes. Just a few months ago, those same teens had been caught vandalizing local businesses. "It's amazing what a little hope can do," Samuel said, following Richard's gaze. The ceramic bowl, which they'd moved to a special place in the new building, seemed to glow in agreement. Its water showed more images, future gatherings, celebrations, lives being changed. Victoria threw herself into the work, showing up early every day to help wherever she was needed. She learned to cook from Betty, to garden from Samuel, to listen from everyone. "I never knew there could be so much satisfaction in simple things," she told Richard one evening as they cleaned up after a community dinner. "Remember how we used to spend thousands on fancy restaurants, but nothing tasted as good as Betty's vegetable soup. Even the town itself was changing. Empty storefronts reopened as local businesses. People walked more slowly down the streets, stopping to talk with neighbors. Gardens appeared in unexpected places. The ceramic bowl's water rippled with new images every day, showing them glimpses of what could be. But more and more, reality was becoming better than any vision. The real miracle, Samuel told everyone at a community meeting, isn't in magical eggs or mysterious bowls. It's in human hearts opening up to each other. It's in hands reaching out to help. It's in second chances and new beginnings. Richard looked around at all the faces he'd come to know and love. Former enemies now friends. Broken people healing. A community growing stronger together. The ceramic bowl glowed softly in its place of honor, its water clear and bright with possibilities. Winter came to the valley, bringing snow and cold winds, but inside the new community center, warmth and hope flourished. The building was finally complete, its windows glowing with welcoming light every evening. Victoria had surprised everyone with her dedication. She worked from sunrise to sunset, learning everything she could. Gone were her designer clothes and perfect manicure. Now she wore sturdy work clothes and didn't mind getting her hands dirty. "I never thought I'd say this," she told Betty one morning while they made bread for the community kitchen, "but I'm happier now than I ever was when I was rich." Betty smiled knowingly. "That's because you're rich in a different way now." The rehabilitation farm, despite the winter weather, was still active. Cold frames protected winter vegetables, and the new greenhouse buzzed with activity. People came every day to work, to learn, and to heal. But the biggest change was coming from an unexpected direction. Alexander's case was finally going to trial, and he had made a shocking decision. "I want to plead guilty," he told Richard during a jail visit. "No deals, no excuses. I need to face what I did." Richard sat in silence for a moment, studying his brother's face through the glass. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Remorse, genuineness, humanity. "Are you sure?" Richard asked. "You'll go to prison for a long time." Alexander nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad, about his change of heart near the end. He saw something important, something I was too blind to see. Now I understand." The day of Alexander's trial, the whole community showed up at the courthouse, not to condemn him but to support both brothers. Alexander stood before the judge and told the whole truth, about killing their father, about poisoning the valley's water, about all his schemes and crimes. His voice shook, but he didn't hold anything back. Then something unexpected happened. Samuel asked to speak to the court. "Your Honor," he said, standing in his simple farmer's clothes, "we don't ask for Alexander Davenport to go free. What he did was wrong and he knows it. But we ask that part of his sentence include making things right." Samuel explained their idea. While in prison, Alexander could use his business knowledge to help plan environmental restoration projects. His money and expertise could help clean up not just their valley, but other places too. The judge listened carefully, then looked at Alexander. "Do you understand what they're offering you? A chance to spend your time in prison doing something meaningful?" Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve their kindness." "Maybe not," the judge said. "But sometimes grace comes to us not because we deserve it, but because we need it." Back at the community center, the ceramic bowl's water showed new visions. Alexander in prison, but not wasting away, teaching other inmates about business ethics, helping design cleanup projects, finding purpose even behind bars. That evening, as snow fell softly outside, the community gathered for their weekly dinner. The big hall was full of delicious smells and happy chatter. Victoria worked in the kitchen, alongside Betty, serving soup and fresh bread. Her face glowed with simple joy as she helped an elderly man to his seat, making sure he was comfortable. Richard watched it all from a quiet corner, amazed at how much had changed. His brother was going to prison, but with a chance to do good. His ex-wife had found a new life of service, and he himself had found a real home. Samuel joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking about those magical eggs," Richard said. "How each one brought a different kind of change. The golden egg taught us about true wealth. The crystal egg healed the land, the glowing egg revealed truth, and now the bowl shows us Possibilities, Samuel added. But you know what? I don't think we need it anymore. He was right. The community had learned to create its own magic. Every day, people helped each other, taught each other, lifted each other up. Later that night, as the last people left the community center, something strange happened. The ceramic bowl began to pulse with light, just like the eggs had done. Betty noticed it first. "Look!" she called out. Everyone gathered around as the water in the bowl began to swirl. Images appeared, not of the future this time, but of the past. They saw the golden egg appearing in the chicken coop, the crystal egg glowing with healing light, the luminous egg revealing hidden truths. Then they saw new images. Alexander in his prison cell already making plans to help others. Victoria teaching a young mother how to make bread. Richard working alongside farmers he once would have looked down on. The magic was never in the eggs or the bowl, Samuel said, softly. It was in us all along. We just needed something to help us see it. As if in response, the bowl's light grew brighter and warmer. The water showed one final image. The whole community gathered together, strong and unified, ready to face whatever came next. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the valley in a clean white blanket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people needing help, new chances to make a difference. But now they knew the truth. Real magic wasn't in golden eggs or mysterious bowls. It was in every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every hand reached out to help another. The ceramic bowl glowed softly in agreement, its water clear and bright with the reflection of all their faces, faces that showed hope, determination, and love. Spring returned to the valley, bringing with it new beginnings. The community center was celebrating its first anniversary, and everyone gathered to mark the occasion. The rehabilitation farm bloomed with new life. Fruit trees planted the previous year were covered in pink and white blossoms. The vegetable gardens stretched out in neat rows, tended by people who had found healing in the soil. Victoria stood in the community center's kitchen, teaching a group of women how to make Betty's famous apple pie. Her students included former socialites like herself, who had discovered there was more to life than designer labels and charity galas. "The secret," Victoria said, her hands covered in flour, "isn't in the ingredients. It's in the love you put into making it." Betty, watching from the doorway, wiped a proud tear from her eye. Alexander, though still in prison, had become a force for change. He used his business skills to create a program helping former inmates start small farming businesses. Every week, he wrote letters to the community center, sharing ideas and asking about everyone's progress. Richard sat in the center's main hall, reading Alexander's latest letter to the gathered community. "Dear friends," he read, "today marks 1 year since I admitted my crimes and started on this new path. The man I was before would have seen prison as the end, but thanks to you all, I've found a beginning instead. Yesterday, we started our first prison garden program. You should have seen the men's faces when they held their first seedlings." The ceramic bowl, still in its place of honor, glowed warmly as Richard read. Its water showed images of prison yards transformed into gardens, of men finding hope in growing things. Samuel stood up to speak next. "Friends," he said, "when those magical eggs first appeared on our farm, we thought they were the miracle. But now we know. The real miracle was how they brought us all together." Everyone nodded in agreement. They had all been part of the story. The teens who had vandalized stores now ran the center's youth program. The addicts who had found healing in the farm now helped newcomers find their way. The wealthy people who had looked down on farmers now worked alongside them, learning the value of honest work. "And we have more news," Betty announced. "The governor has asked us to help set up similar centers across the state, our little valleys. Healing is spreading!" The ceramic bowl's water rippled with new visions. Community centers rising in other towns, more gardens growing, more lives changing. Richard looked around at all the faces he had come to know and love. So different from the ruthless businessman he'd been just a year ago. "I've been thinking," he said, standing up, "about what to do with Davenport Industries. Alexander and I have talked it over, and we've made a decision." He pulled out some papers. "We're turning the company into a non-profit foundation, All its resources will go to supporting sustainable farming, environmental cleanup, and centers like this one. The announcement was met with applause and tears of joy. The ceramic bowl glowed brighter than ever, its water showing glimpses of a future where business and farming worked together in harmony. Later that evening, as the sun set over the valley, everyone gathered in the center's garden for a celebration dinner. Tables groaned under the weight of home-cooked food: Betty's pies, Victoria's bread, vegetables from the rehabilitation farm, and dishes representing every family in the community. Samuel raised his glass in a toast to the golden egg that taught us about true wealth, to the crystal egg that healed our land, to the glowing egg that showed us truth, and to the bowl that showed us possibilities. But most of all, Betty added, to the miracle of community, to second chances and new beginnings. To love, Victoria said softly. To family, Richard finished, both the kind you're born with and the kind you find. As if in response to their words, the ceramic bowl began to glow brighter than ever before. Its light spread out over the gathering, touching each person with warmth and blessing. Then slowly the bowl's water began to rise into the air, forming a shimmering sphere. Inside it, they could see every moment of their journey, the first golden egg appearing, Richard's transformation, Victoria's return, Alexander's redemption, and countless small miracles of healing and hope. The sphere of water burst like a gentle firework, sending drops of light falling over everyone like blessed rain. Where each drop landed, flowers bloomed, even in places where nothing had grown before. When the light faded, the ceramic bowl had transformed one final time. Now it was a simple drinking fountain in the center of the garden, offering clean, sweet water to anyone who needed it. Samuel smiled. Perfect, he said, because that's what community is, a place where anyone can come to drink, to rest, to find what they need. The story of Reed Farm and its magical eggs became a legend in the EE Valley, passed down through generations. But the real magic, everyone knew, wasn't in the eggs or the bowl or even the mysterious rain of light. The real magic was in the changed hearts, the healed land, the restored families, and the community that had learned to love and care for each other. And in the garden of the community center, where the drinking fountain still stands, flowers bloom all year round. They say if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, you can hear the faint sound of eggs humming, reminding everyone that miracles happen not through golden treasures, but through simple acts of love and kindness. Richard, Victoria, and all the others had learned this truth, and in learning it, they had found something far more precious than any golden egg. They had found their way home.